John chapter 16. And we're going to read several verses here. We have 3 weeks left in this series in the Upper Room Discourse. We're going to look at John chapter 17 the next 2 Sundays, Lord willing. This morning, let's look at verses 16 to 33 of chapter 16. And Jesus went on to say, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then, after a little while, you will see me." At this, some of his disciples said to one another, "What does he mean by saying, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? And because I am going to the Father?" They kept asking, "What does he mean by a little while? We don't understand what he is saying." And Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this. So he said to them, "Are you asking one another what I meant when I said, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? Very truly, I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief. But I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, you will no longer ask me anything. Very truly, I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now, you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask, and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. Though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language, but will tell you plainly about my Father. In that day, you will ask in my name. I am not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and entered the world, and now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father." Then the disciples said, "Now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God." "Do you now believe?" Jesus replied. "A time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." This is the word of the Lord. A great passage. We've been looking this summer at these chapters 14 through 17, and what they say about what it means to live the Christian life. Jesus giving instructions to his disciples right before his death, his betrayal, his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion. And Jesus is giving these instructions to his disciples, instructions about how to live. We've been looking this summer at what the different aspects of what this shows us about what that means. And this morning, we see a passage in which we learn from Jesus something that may be a surprise to you, maybe not. Jesus says the Christian life is a life of joy. A life of joy. This is a passage about joy. Now, let's get clear on what we mean. When Jesus speaks of joy, it is very clear in this passage, isn't it? It's very clear that he is talking about something more wonderful, something deeper, something richer than what we might call happiness or what we might call good circumstances. Oh, what a wonderful feeling. Oh, what a wonderful day. Oh, what a wonderful feeling. Everything's going my way. You know that kind of feeling? That's a good feeling. Jesus isn't talking about that. He's talking about something deeper. It's clear, isn't it? Jesus says, he's very realistic. Jesus believed in the comfort of realistic expectations. And so he says to them, what is coming is you're going to grieve. He's very clear. He says to them, you're going to grieve. You're going to mourn. And indeed, this is true. He's talking about the fact that in just a matter of hours, they are going to have Jesus taken from them. They are going to fail miserably, and they will, within a few hours, these same people be weeping. We know this from other gospel accounts, weeping as their Lord suffers and dies. Jesus is not talking about everything going great all the time. And we know that at the end because he says, look, in this world you will have trouble. And yet, though we shouldn't think that this is just some kind of flippant, light happiness, Jesus is also clear, you will have joy. The Christian life is a life of joy, something deeper, a deep confidence, a welling up sense of peace and security, and even the kind of joy that spreads to your face. You know that kind of joy? Jesus is not talking about, let's not go on the one side and think that Jesus is just talking about, oh, what a wonderful feeling, or what everything's going my way. But let's not go to the other side and say that means joy means it's something that you always walk around like this saying, my heart overflows. No, not joy in the Scripture. Something else, something that in the midst of this world, in all of its brokenness, and all of its pain, and all of the trials that comes, nonetheless is rock solid, steady sense of well-being, ultimate good that even swells up into your face. Well, maybe better than me describing it like that, let me give you a couple of pictures of what joy, I think, in the Scriptures looks like. One from the Bible, one from Christian history. I think joy, maybe a great picture of joy, is the spiritual sung by slaves, the kind of music you hear in black churches, our brothers and sisters. Slaves who were in the fields, in slavery, oppressed, and who sang with great confidence, and when you hear it, there is an explosive joy about a coming redemption and a loving Lord. Not just a deep, soulful recognition of what is wrong, but a deep and explosive joy. Do you know that kind of joy? Or maybe it's the kind of joy similar to that in the famous story about Paul and Silas, who were imprisoned, beaten, thrown into a jail, first century primitive jail, and in the middle of the night, they made it echo as they sang songs of worship to the Lord. That was, with all due respect, Donna Crockett, to Elvis, the original jailhouse rock, right there. Recognition of things are wrong, and yet an unquenchable joy, even a joy that spreads to your face. Jesus taught us, the whole Bible says to us, that the Christian life is to be a life of this kind of joy. Why? Why? 3 reasons. I want to show you 3 reasons from this text that the Christian life is a life of joy. And we'll start at the beginning. Here's the first one. Starting in these first few verses, after Jesus describes what is going to happen to them, he begins to speak to them, and he gives them this incredible picture of joy that tells us this. First reason why the Christian life is a life of joy, because our suffering has a limit and a purpose. A limit and a purpose. So Jesus speaks to them straightforwardly about their grief. He uses a number of different words. You will weep, you will mourn, you will grieve. But he says your grief, verse 20, will turn to joy. And then he gives a picture that shows them. He says to them, interestingly, right? Your grief will turn to joy. Your grief won't be the end of the story. Grief doesn't get the last word. But instead, he says he gives a picture of what their experience will be like. He says in verse 21, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. It's a wonderful, wonderful image. And fascinating that Jesus uses it. Labor, that's why they call it labor. It's hard, painful work, giving birth. So I have heard. And Jesus didn't experience that himself, but think of the wonderful humanity, the truly human nature of Jesus living in the first century world. In the first century world, healthcare didn't happen at a hospital. Dying happened in the home, birthing happened in the home, nursing happened in the home. I wonder how many times Jesus' birth was in a stable. I wonder how many times Jesus heard the cries of women giving birth, and then saw and heard the joy of new life. And he grabs hold of this image, which we'll see is not just from human experience, it's also from the prophets, but he grabs hold of this image and he uses this to explain. And he uses strong words, the words for pain and anguish. He says the woman in her pain cries out in anguish. They're strong words. It's real anguish. But then he says it's anguish that has a limit. It ends. And when it is finished, it's rather quickly forgotten. Now let's be careful here, but have you noticed how some of the intense pains of life, not all, but some of them, they hurt terribly, and then when relieved, you just forget about them. You move on. You get out of trouble. You've forgotten more headaches than you've had. Right? You have heartaches that you had when you were in high school, or that some of you are in high school having heartaches now, that one day you'll have trouble even remembering how it hurt you so. Some pain, we know this experience, some pain, it has a limit, and when it ends, we move on. And Jesus, not flippantly, listen, not flippantly, but joyously, with resurrection hope, is saying, in God's providence, in the long scope of time, the deepest pains of this life will end, will be no more. And in the providence and in the resurrection life of God, you'll have trouble even remembering how deep that hurt was. Not flippant, but what hope. There's a limit. It will end. And you know, particularly, it is not just that suffering has a limit, it will end, but that how much better, how much easier to move on when you see that everything you have suffered even had a purpose. So part of why the anguish is forgotten, he says, is because of the woman's joy that a child is born into the world. There is a purpose to it. Now, again, we should not be flippant. We cannot quickly say to everybody who is suffering, in fact, many times the most important thing to do when someone is suffering is not to say, don't worry, there's a good reason for this. It's to say, let me listen to you. Can I pray for you? But we should know this truth as well. This is part of the comfort. We should work deeply into our bones as Christians, that in the providence of God, our Redeemer, he takes even our pain and our suffering, and he brings good purpose out of it. He does. And we know this even from life. We know this even from common grace. There's a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt who has written about this. He's written about the kinds of good. He took it on himself as a psychologist to try to write about some of the kinds of good that come out of adversity. He wrote this. He wrote, people need adversity, setbacks, and perhaps even very difficult things to reach the highest levels of strength and fulfillment and personal development. He noted, he said, in other words, there are some aspects of human nature that can only come out in the face of difficulty. So he pointed out some of those benefits. He said, resilience. What doesn't kill you does make you stronger. Strengthened relationships. How many of you can testify to this? He says, relationships with family and friends, when you go through something hard together, can go deeper than they could ever have gone apart from that. And he says, interestingly, he's not a Christian, he said, this changes your people's priorities and philosophies. In other words, people suffer and they learn all of a sudden how to be compassionate, or they learn that the things they've been living for are really not the things worth living for. People have dramatic, wonderful, good changes that can happen when we suffer. This is just opening up our mind for a moment, just to think with me. Haven't you experienced things like this? That there can be good that comes out of it. C.S. Lewis, the Bible speaks like this. C.S. Lewis put it this way: pain insists upon being attended to. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. In other words, even in pain, God gets our attention to him in ways we don't pay attention otherwise. And all of this would be cold comfort if it wasn't for this fact that what you have is not just a couple of platitudes about good that could come out, but what you have is the Savior of the universe, one who suffered on a cross so that you could be saved, who endured, it says in Hebrews, a pain for the joy that was set before him, the hope on the other side. What you have is a risen Lord, if you are a Christian, who says to you, your pain has a limit, and though you may not see it in this life, it will be used by me for a good purpose. And this gives grounds for a kind of joy. Yeah, he starts in the darkest place, doesn't he? This is a promise that comes to us. Pain and loss has an expiration date, but a new day is coming. That's the first reason. Why is the Christian life a life of joy? Because our suffering has a limit and a purpose. But he moves on and gives another reason. And this is wonderful. Why is the Christian life a life of joy? Here's the second reason. Because our God is a God of joy who wants to share his joy with us. Now, is that your picture of God? A God of joy? You know, there's a philosopher named Max Scheler who wrote a few years ago about the Christian view, the distinctiveness of the Christian view of pain and suffering, and he contrasted it with the ancient world. The ancient world believed that the gods were all kind of nasty, kind of human and very intemperate and all kinds of stuff. And they believed as well that joy, the good things of life, were on the surface, but when you got down to the core of life, you found that everything was dark and sad. Did you know one of the most famous inscriptions on tombstones in Rome was this? I'm not going to attempt the Latin. Was this: I was not, I was, I am not, I care not. You know, that is the philosophy of life. I was not, I was, I am not, I care not. And it's in that kind of context that the famous saying, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," arose. It's a sense that happiness is on the surface. You may as well get as much happiness as you can, because happiness is up here on the surface. But when you get down to the core of life, what you find is a dark void. But Scheler says Christian view is completely different. The Christian view says that right now, on the surface of life, you experience very real and very painful suffering and trauma and challenges. But when you get down to the core of life, when you go back to the one who's at the center of all existence, what you find is bright and glorious and overflowing and eternal joy and love. How different. Glory before the foundation of the world, a fountain overflowing of light and love, not darkness and void. This is who God is, and I've been trying to point this out to you as we've been going through John, that Jesus points this out again and again. Whenever he pulls us out in the Gospel of John and shows us, before eternity, he shows us love and life and light in the existence of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Always existing in love and joy. Our God is a God of joy, and this is why Jesus himself, when he came, was a man who was, I believe, full of joy. Do you think of Jesus that way? His opponents did, interestingly. You know, Jesus, here's the thing. Andrew Wilson, who's a writer, says that Jesus was immersed. When you read the Gospels, you see a man who immersed himself in the sorrows of others, didn't he? He was always around the sick. He was always around the very troubled. He was always around people who were dying. He experienced more suffering and pain and illness and trouble than most of us will in an entire lifetime. He did in like an afternoon. He was right in the middle of it. And yet at the same time, he told interesting stories. I think I could try to prove this to you. I think he had a great sense of humor when you read the Gospels. And, Andrew Wilson puts it this way: he was always sitting at the fun table. You know? His table was always the fun table. I loved it. He said, this is what Wilson writes: he's always sitting at the fun table, so much so that his enemies accuse him, in words that we know the Gospel writers would never make up, of being a drunkard and a glutton. His friends thought, this guy's having too much fun, something must be wrong. Our God, have you thought of this? Our God is a God of joy who wants to share his joy with you. So in this chapter, Jesus says In the verses right after this, he says, "So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, when I see you and give you joy, in that day you will no longer ask me anything. Very truly I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask, and you will receive, and your joy will be complete." Isn't that interesting? Jesus doesn't say, ask and you will receive and you will do everything you're supposed to do. Jesus says, ask and you will receive and you'll have joy so full, it will be amazing. You'll have no more room for joy. You'll be as full as you can get. In fact, this is what Jesus says in the chapters right before and after this chapter. In John chapter 15:11, this is Jesus' words to his disciples. John chapter 15:11, one chapter before. He says, "I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." The God of joy wants to give you his joy so you'll be full of joy. Or in John chapter 17, he's praying to the Father, Jesus is, and he says, "I'm coming to you, Father, now, but I say these things while I'm still in the world, so that they may have," he's speaking of his disciples, "may have the full measure of my joy within them." What a wonderful truth. Here's the second reason Christians are to be a people of joy. Our God is a God of joy, and he wants to share that joy with us. Do you see God this way? Does this characterize the way you think of God? You know, a primal source, I believe this, a primal source of sin, doing wrong in our lives, is seeing God as stingy and grumpy and squashing our fun. That's a primal source of sin. You know, back in Genesis chapter 3, how does the serpent tempt Adam to sin? You know what he does? He comes to Eve and Adam, and he says, "Did God say you can't eat anything?" Is that what God? And God had said, "You can eat all these trees. There's one you're not supposed to." And he says, "Isn't God say not to eat something?" He's holding out on you, isn't he? In fact, this is the lie that the serpent says. He says, God doesn't want you to eat it because he knows if you eat it, you'll have the really good stuff and you'll be like him. In other words, you are a better judge of your own happiness than God. You better take things in your own hands. It's a belief that God actually maybe isn't joyful, or at least isn't out for our joy. And this is what sin is. So God says, be generous with your money. He says the rich fall into a trap. He says it is better to give than to receive. This is the way of joy. Even the commands he gives are for our joy. And we say, no, but I want what I want. God says, be holy in your sexual life. Follow my design so that you may have not just lust but love, not just pleasure but purpose and wisdom and deep relationship. And we say, I want what I want. God says, tell the truth. God says, pursue me. This is the way of joy. And we believe, I think I know better how to have a good time. It's a primal source of sin. But when we get a little further, we realize that sin is like a mirage. It may be pleasurable for a season, but we dive into it. You know, a mirage, it looks like water in the desert, and then you dive into it looking for water, and you end up with a mouthful of sand. And the God of the Bible is a God of joy who comes to us in joy and says, I want to share it with you. Do you believe this? These are two reasons. Our suffering has a limit and a purpose. Our God is a God of joy. He wants to share that joy with us. And I do mean with us, I do mean a joy that is for any of us who will come. Because third reason, last reason, why the Christian life is a life of joy. Because the joy of Jesus is a gift of grace. So, look what happens next. He tells them to come. He tells them to ask so that their joy may be full. And then the disciples said, now you're speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you do know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. Aren't these strange words? I mean, they strike you as a little odd. Jesus is talking, and all of a sudden the disciples are talking, and they're saying, oh, okay, we get you. We get you now. Now we're in the same line. I got you, Jesus. Understand you perfectly, and finally now, we believe in you, buddy. I think here's the best way I think to understand it. They're proud. Just like Peter. You remember Peter? Before the suffering comes, Peter says, Jesus, I want to follow you everywhere, and don't worry, everyone else will turn your back on you, but not me. I got your back, Jesus. Well, the disciples here likewise say, okay, got you, Jesus. We understand perfectly. No problem. We believe. And Jesus says, oh, now you believe? I think this is sarcastic. Oh, now you believe? I've been with you for 3 years. I've shown you all kinds of miracles. I've taught you forever. Oh, now you get it? And then he goes on to say, my friends, and I think you have to understand it like this. I'm going to show you. My friends, you don't know anything yet. You know the saying that people have about the weather in Maine, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute. The paraphrase is Jesus says, oh, you believe now? Wait a minute. Because he says, do you now believe? Verse 32, a time is coming, and in fact has come, it's right here, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Jesus punctures, confronts them with, again, the Jesus who believes in realistic expectations, punctures any growing sense of self-sufficiency in his disciples. Let me just say, let me put it this way. Our joy in this world does not come from our own achievement. And in fact, as much as pain and suffering threatens joy in this world, it is also threatened by our own mess, our own failures, our own realization of our insufficiency, our own sense of how we have failed. And for the disciples, this is part of the grief that is coming. They need a joy. Peter, it says in Luke, Peter is about to weep bitterly in the streets of Jerusalem, not just because he lost his Lord, but because he failed him. And this is another threat to our joy, isn't it? The deep, lurking sense that we have messed things up too much, and there is no way for us to set them right or to receive from God anything good. And so Jesus here goes directly at it. He says, look, guys, hold on. Don't get ahead of yourselves. Don't get all serious and stuffy and proud. Joy that I have to give is something better than that. It is a joy that comes not from your doing, but from my grace. It is a joy that is the joy that I give to you freely and graciously and generously and without limit as a gift, not because you're so good, not because you figured it out. And boy, that's a ground for a pretty deep joy. Not the joy that's like, well, I finally earned it and I think I can celebrate for a little while. The kind of joy that just blows earning out of the water. The kind of joy that comes from a Jesus who looks at you when you've messed everything up and says, I want you to be joyful. And in fact, in order for you to know the joy of the Lord, this is what Jesus says to the disciples, you all are going to run away from me. You're going to be so scared of suffering, you're going to flee. But I, for your joy, am going to stay the course, go to the cross, so that I can pour out on you without limit and beyond all you deserve, joy and grace that will never end. Now, if you get that down in your soul, that's joy. That's a source of joy. Jonathan Edwards, who's a New England pastor down in Northampton, he was fired summarily by his church. One summer, and I think it was 1742. I probably have that wrong. It was a long time ago. And one of his contemporaries said of Jonathan Edwards, when wrote of how he handled being fired, I've said this before, but I love this quote. He wrote of Jonathan Edwards, his joy, he behaved himself as a man whose joy was in a place where his enemies couldn't touch it. And you see, Jesus is saying, I want to give you a joy that is beyond your ability and in fact is at a place where your sin, past and present, can't touch it because it comes from me. It is a gift. And so Jesus says along the same lines, I have told you these things. This is why. He rebukes them. He says, look, you're going to fail, but look, listen to me. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world, which means I've overcome the world for you. The Christian life is a life of joy for these reasons. Suffering has a limit and a purpose. Our God is a God of joy. He wants to share that joy with you, and Jesus gives that joy as a gift of grace. Let me ask you as we close, how are you doing with joy? I confess I've been thinking about it for a while now, and I am convinced I need more. And here's the wonderful thing. Jesus says, ask. Maybe what some of us need to do today is simply to take a few moments to ask God for joy and confess that we've been viewing him as stingy and miserly and holding out. Maybe what we need is to seek counsel, to talk to another Christian, to begin to press into scripture passages that have to do with joy, to fight for joy in a real way. Maybe even right now we just need the work of the Holy Spirit to assure us that we are forgiven and to give us a joy that doesn't come from us but comes from the depths of who God is. Because at the deepest core of existence is a God of glorious joy who gives that joy to us. So, we're going to stand and sing in a moment. Would you take a moment and pray with me? Ask the Lord to speak his word to our heart, and then stand and sing.